Today, we're going to talk about what I think is one of the biggest upcoming challenges for the church, and it's what some people call the woke right. What is the woke right? What is wokeness? How are we supposed to think about these things? We're going to talk about that coming up. This is the Bible Sojourner, where we discuss issues related to the Bible, theology, and culture. I'm your host, Peter Gaiman, professor of Old Testament and Biblical Languages at Shepherd's Theological Seminary. Shalom and welcome. Thanks for joining. Welcome back to another episode of the Bible Sojourner, and today we're going to talk about something that we haven't talked about in a really long time. You know, when we have episodes, usually we talk about biblical issues, maybe cultural, contextual, grammatical, something biblically related, but I also like to talk about cultural issues as well. And if you've been a listener to the podcast before we even started doing YouTube videos, you may remember back in 2020, we did a series on the woke culture and critical race theory. And we even did some LGBT episodes, transgenderism and the like. And I think those are really important to talk about. In fact, some of you may or may not know that my dissertation was actually on LGBT issues, specifically homosexuality and how the church should think through a lot of those issues. So I've always been very interested in cultural phenomenon, and I think it is a important thing for Christians in the church to actually take time to think about some of these, things that rear their head, as it were. And so I wanted to take today's episode and talk about what I think is a very important issue, and one that maybe a lot of you don't know that this is an important issue within the church, because a lot of it is social media related, but then it also is attracting a lot of people, young people in the church. So I really want to talk about this. Now, we're going to be talking about what's known as the woke right. And depending where you line up on the political spectrum, you may think of that as an inherent derogatory term. And I'm not using it that way. I'm trying to use it descriptively, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But it's gone by other names. Years ago, we're talking about 2 or 3, not like beyond that, but 2 or 3 years ago, I actually, in talking with people about future challenges the church would face, I used to call this phenomenon, which goes by many names, and some people call it woke right, etc. I used to call it Christless conservatism, was what I would usually term it as. Some people call it the dissident right. Some people have called it the new Christian right. There are lots of different names that explain this phenomenon, and it is a bit of a debate right now how to describe it. But there's a reason that I think woke right refers to a apt description, and we're going to talk about what that is going forward. Now, the reason we want to talk about it, though, is just because it is something that is impacting the church. The church where I currently serve at, I've seen, it in multiple people's lives, just having influenced this kind of thinking. And so we, as Christians, need to, pull back the curtain, as it were, and think about it. Okay. So as any good discussion going forward, we need to define some terms, right? So I want to define some terms and give you a little bit of background to this discussion. And some of you, this will be good review because you know this. Some of you do not know this, and so it's even better review, but it's not review, it's an introduction. So basically, when we talk about critical theory, all right, critical theory is what undergirds a lot of this discussion. Critical theory is basically a brainchild from the Frankfurt School, Germany, a group of Marxist scholars. They decided to, develop an understanding of the world in systematic categorization. They would divide it into social and economic, cultural forces and groups, and try to understand the world within power struggles, and also understand the world between class dynamics, the powerful oppressing, the marginalized, etc. Now, classical Marxism was essentially economic at its core, but the neo-Marxist approach, which came from the Frankfurt School and was kind of the impetus for critical theory, basically focused on categories like race and gender and sexuality and other group focuses for identity. Okay. And so the idea central to kind of critical theory, and by the way, you've probably heard of some critical theories, like critical race theory has been in the news a lot. And I've done presentations, written articles on thinking through that. So you've heard of critical race theory, and critical race theory is basically, as the name suggests, a understanding and a framework by which you can understand the effect of one's race, or better said, ethnicity, on their social capital or their social standing, and how the race dynamics work, why white people interact with black people certain ways, etc. Okay, so that's critical race theory. But there's also gender queer theory. There's all sorts of, there's even, fat theory, whatever you want to fill in the blanks with that. There are different dynamics of grouping people together. And the whole idea behind a critical theory is, and again, I encourage you to go back. Unfortunately, they're only in audio, but I encourage you to go back and listen to some of the episodes I did explaining a lot of these theories and how they work and how postmodernism relates to that. But the main component, just for review, for those of you who just want the crash course on this, the main component of these critical theories is that they're designed to assess what we would call the hegemonic forces at work. So hegemonic means like the dominant or the powerful structures that exist, and to figure out a way to dismantle those. Okay, so that's and because the assumption is that these forces that are implemented by those people in power, and they're, so the often the term racism has been really changed over the last 34 years to indicate not just an overt action, but even a structure. So you've heard of systemic racism. Well, this is kind of the idea that flows from critical theory, where even the structures that exist in society are designed to elevate the white male and to suppress females, to suppress people of color, to present, like the oppression exists systemically, not just in action, not just in, the two people who meet on the street, but the whole system, the way society is designed, is inherently racist to negatively impact a person of color or things like that. Okay. And so it views the world in these oppression, inequality dynamics. And so that's how a lot of people process things. And, unbelievers especially, I mean, the reason 2020 was such a turning point for people was because they realized that, wow, our society has been completely inundated with these neo-Marxist ideas, viewing things in class struggles, oppressor-oppressed dynamics, etc. And so this is where the term or the idea of being woke actually comes from, because the idea of being woke is that you have awakened to this reality of there's an oppressor and oppressed dynamic. There's this class struggle, this class identity that you're involved with, and you've become awakened to that reality. Okay. And I just want to read a definition here that comes from Laura A. Roy, and in her book, Teaching While White, she gives a definition or an understanding of what wokeness is. And I think it's good to just hear it from the source, as it were. So this is what she writes. The notion of getting woke or staying woke is defined as being acutely aware of racial and social injustice, not just awareness and acknowledgement of isolated incidents, but awareness from a position of understanding systemic and institutional racism. The notion of getting woke encapsulates the first stage of becoming an accomplice in addressing the system of racism. White accomplices should strive to be woke enough not to call themselves woke, and instead strive to embody this state of being by building with people of color. Be in a perpetual state of learning and be woke enough to know you are never woke enough. All right, now that's the end of the quote. And basically what she's saying there is that, being woke is not something you can claim to have attained to. It's a process or a state of being where you are constantly realizing more and more the oppression that exists, the systemic oppression, etc., the problems of society, and then you are continuing to work to tear those things down. Okay. And so critical theory exists not just to be an analytical tool. Okay. It's not intended to just be merely an analytical tool. It's actually designed to destroy and to tear down what currently exists in society in order to build back a utopia or something like that. And so it's a transformative tool. And throughout the years, I mean, it's existed for a long time. We're talking, 40, 50 years, even beyond that, if we're talking about in the 30s, in the Frankfurt School, 1930s, et cetera. So it's approaching the 100 years where this has been quite impactful on societies, especially Western societies. And so when we're looking at this, I think it's helpful to understand that people have had a reaction against it. And I think it's been a good reaction. They've seen that this is very unfulfilling. A lot of people have given their, younger years to it, and then they come out of it on the other side and they say, wow, that is totally unfulfilling. This is not even right or fair, actually, if I'm trying to, take the wealth away from the rich people because I think they have too much and I'm trying to have an equitable society. That's just not how it works. When people have families, they become less Marxist because they realize, well, listen, I want control over what my kids do because I know what's best for them and things like that. And we acknowledge that. And I think a large portion for why the 2024 election turned out the way that it did was because there was a response to this just, rampant wokeness everywhere. Okay. But what we have seen also is a bit of a return to, or not a return per se, but a evolution, if you will. But I want to talk about that in just a second. First, I want to give kind of how some of the main problems with the leftist version of wokeism. And then the reason I think it's important to talk about that is because later on, when we talk about the right or the conservative movement, we will also see some parallels there. Okay. And so just to summarize, if we're defining wokeness, the core concept of wokeness is it's an awareness of this systemic oppression that can be based on your race, your class, or your sexuality, or some other norm that is considered because society is determining that norm. In fact, I think at some point in the podcast, 5 years ago or something, I even showed some mathematical examples where people were saying math is a hegemonic norm, which is basically a tool of the white supremacist, et cetera. So obviously it goes crazy. There are people who have really argued in crazy ways for this. And so that's the core concept. Being woke is you're awakening to that reality. You have a critical consciousness then, which is basically the idea or the understanding that there is a privilege that's built into society. And for the left, that means that, the white hegemonic power structure is influencing all people. People are benefiting from that. So me, as a white male cisgender, I am so privileged that I don't have any understanding of what it would actually be to be oppressed because I live and I'm propagating this society. Even if it's unintentionally, I'm so much a part of that I'm propagating it to the detriment of other marginalized classes. Okay. And so the goal ultimately is to actually just have a massive societal transformation. That is critical theory's goal. Now, some of the problems with that. Okay. So that's kind of the summary. The problems would be that there's a huge emphasis on the group identity rather than the individual identity, okay? And so critical theory prioritizes the fact that you're a part of a group, you're oppressed or oppressor, you are oppressing or you are being oppressed. And so your group identity is actually what dictates your experience. If you are a person of color, if you are ethnic minority, if you are a sexual minority, you inherently are oppressed. And even if you can't point to a specific instance where you are oppressed, the society around you is oppressing you, and it's designed to facilitate your oppression, okay? So the individual actions, motivations, those are dismissed, okay? And this was really brought to the fore even in the discussion of interracial marriage, because it's interesting because on the left side of things, yeah, this is where it gets crazy, because both the far right, the woke right, and the woke left are both against interracial marriage, which is kind of crazy in for a variety of reasons. But on the left, the interracial marriage would be viewed as racism because, whoever the white person is in the relationship, for example, is trying to take advantage of the person of color or the ethnic minority. And so that is racism, or even trying to make up for their guilt of the racist activity that they have perpetuated in the past. And so now they're trying to be nice to a person of color, and that's racist. It's just like there's no win. In fact, I was talking to a friend of mine who was Black one time, and we were talking about this, and he mentioned, yeah, it's really kind of disgusting, because no matter what you do, you are racist. Whether you do action A or action B or action C, they're all racist for all different reasons. Your motivation has nothing to do with it. So the group identity is the core issue for this worldview. And this is what's frustrating, right? The group identity is being emphasized over the individual accountability. And you've even heard people say, well, Black people deserve reparations because of slavery, and all white people need to pay because they were the ones who perpetuated it. I mean, just ignore the fact, and we've talked about this before, but just ignore the fact that there were Black slaveholders. Ignore the fact that there were white people who were enslaved. Ignore all that reality, okay? It's just that your group identity is us versus them. This is what this group deserves. This is what that group deserves. And that's how, woke identity is formulated. And that's a huge problem, okay? Scripture does not talk in those terms, but, even as I'm describing this, maybe you can already start to think, oh, I've actually heard things from conservatives or the far right of the political spectrum where it sounds similar. And yes, you have. You have heard things that are similar, and we'll talk more about that, okay? All right, so that's the first problem. Second problem, so the first problem being group identity over individual identity. That's very problematic from a Christian worldview. As Scripture talks about it, you are not held accountable for the sins of the father, and so we need to understand Scripture does teach an individual accountability. That's just basic Christian doctrine. Now, problem two would be having an unbiblical epistemology. So epistemology is the study of how you know things. I know it's a fancy term, but it's important to know. So epistemology, the study of how you know or how you know things. And critical theory teaches that you can only know something, you have access to knowledge, that there's not objective truth. It's more of where you stand in relation to the group that gives you access to knowledge. So people have actually called it standpoint epistemology, or it's very similar to the idea of standpoint epistemology, meaning that where you stand, thus the standpoint, gives you a specific access to knowledge. So what does that mean? So you can't know what it's like to be oppressed because you're not Black, for example. You can't have a opinion on abortion because you're not a woman, because you don't know what it's like to deliver a child or whatever. So the point is, because you are not a part of a certain group in your identity, you are incapable of having knowledge about that. I think the illustration I've heard people give, which I think is a good one, is like having glasses on, okay? So unless you have a certain experience or group identity, usually it's a group identity, obviously, then you don't have the glasses on. You can't actually see in the full color spectrum to understand things. And so the scriptural picture of truth being objective is really downplayed. Scripture says that truth is accessible through the revelation of God, through natural revelation even of how he's revealed things. And so standpoint epistemology, these critical theories, are relying on the fact that people would say, no, only if you're a part of this group can you actually know these things, okay? And so I think that is, again, a very significant biblical problem. And I've actually written some blog articles that, if I remember, I'll try to link to, on why, experience is not a good pathway to wisdom and knowledge. It can be a pathway to wisdom and knowledge, but it's not a good one because it's not reliable. All right, so that's another big problem. And then finally, just as another, there could be many, many problems we could talk about, but I think I just want to give some of the core issues that are at play here. A third problem would be having an inherently negative interpretation of all situations. And I kind of hinted at this earlier, but critical theory assumes systemic oppression in all situation. In fact, I remember Robin DiAngelo when I was studying this in detail, and I had to read all the books and do all that stuff, and it just really, it made me go almost crazy. And so as I was reading a lot of these books, I just remember some of these quotes, and Robin DiAngelo had a quote where she said, it's not a question of if something is racist, it's a question of how is it racist. And I just remember thinking to myself, wow, that is so negative. That's so her presupposition is that whatever the situation is, however it's developing, it is racist. It is, a pawn of the system. It's trying to, oppress somebody and keep somebody down. And so we just need to recognize how that is so that we can continue to fight against everything. So it's not a matter of if something is racist, but just how is it being racist so we can fight against it. And, the assumption is that the current power structure is causing all the problems. And if something happens, it's the fault of those structures. And so we need to fight against the structures. The structures are negative. And so all the results that come from the structures are negative. And can you just imagine living that way? Can you imagine a church that has, any ethnic minority and Caucasians and whatever, and just interacting in that capacity where they're always just talking about, okay, all right, so I invited you to lunch, so let's talk about how that was racist. Okay, I actually thought I should confront you for sin, but now I realize that was totally racist of me. It's just like, obviously that's ridiculous. As one friend of mine put it, you would have the entire church walking on eggshells just because everything is being critiqued, everything negative. And that's what critical theory does teach you to do, is to be just detrimentally negative and critical about everything. Okay. And you just cannot exist in that life. And that's why we've seen such a blowback against this movement. And that's, why I think the election went the way it is. There were so many people who had once allied themselves with the progressives and leftists, and they said, you know what, I can't live in a world like this. And you actually saw it because you had people who were, I actually felt bad. Like, I legitimately felt bad. You had people like Starbucks managers and people who were, champions of the leftist cause, and the left would eat them up and spit them out just because they were not leftist enough. They were not progressive enough, because that's the whole movement of critical theory, is you must continue to critique, continue to battle. You can't ever say something is fixed. Otherwise, you are then a tool and a pawn of the power structure. You get it? So inherently, this is one of the worst things, is that there's a perpetual and eternal negativity that's brought about by critical theory, because you're always looking for the problems, because you're taught that the system is oppressing and it's the system's fault, and the people who put it in there are evil. And even if the people who are currently there, maybe there's people that aren't so evil, but it's the system, and they're protecting the system, therefore they are evil. And even if somebody is supposedly a champion of your cause and they would identify with you, etc., they might even be on, whatever liberal spectrum you want. If they're not fighting as hard as they can to help destroy the systems, they themselves are perpetuating the evil of these systems. So it really is crazy if you think about how wokeism has influenced and affected society. And so that's why it's been a while since I've talked about it here on the podcast, but that's why I've been adamant. I've spoken at churches, done conferences on it, and I've tried to just really push that this is such an evil way of thinking, and it's totally unbiblical, not what Christians are to be involved with at all. But that brings us to the real issue today that we're trying to talk about. That's basically all review of things that I hope people already know, but it's something that I have seen seeping into the conservative movement, so-called conservative movement, and I think even into the church. I think I've seen a lot of people influenced by the critical theories and how they ought to think in class struggles. Okay. And so we're going to talk about this. Now, in order to understand it, I've already used some of this language, but I want you to think about it in terms of left and right. In political jargon, this is perhaps an oversimplification, but just so you know, the left, when people talk about the left, they talk about a viewpoint that is emphasizing progressivism, and you're trying to move towards something. And so that's, moving usually towards social equality, collective responsibility, addressing systemic injustice, so social justice movement, et cetera. That's the left of the political spectrum, is you're always trying to do more, if you want to say it that way. The right, on the other hand, it tends to be associated with conservatism, to conserve something, to conserve where you're at, not move, but to conserve. And that, I think, is probably maybe a slight mischaracterization, because conservatism wouldn't have to be the right necessarily. It would just be you're trying to conserve the status quo. But what we're seeing now is what, on the spectrum, the true right, as it were, is you're actually trying to advance, but you're not trying to maintain the status quo, because people say the status quo is terrible. We don't like the status quo. It stinks. And they don't want to go to the left. They don't want to have more progressive policies, but they want more conservative policies. They want more control over morality, and they want, things like that. So you're actually seeing a push right, which actually borrows a lot from the leftist framework which has existed for so long. Okay, so the right, as it's described now, is kind of a push in the opposite direction, where you want to move toward so-called traditional values, maybe family. Let's push in a direction where family is recognized as being more important instead of sexual freedom or something like that. And so that's associated with right. So right and left are talked about with regard to political views. And so one of the key components here when we're talking about this is that it's not inherently a Christian conversation. I know a lot of people want to make it that. In fact, some people have actually just said that being woke right is actually just being historic Christian. But that's not true. It's talked about with regard to politics, and American politics in particular, just because that's the context in which we're talking about. So if you are listening to this from another country, I'm actually not sure what the political climate would be. I know there are some listeners from Germany and South Africa, so I'm not sure what the politics are like there. But in most cases, you have left and right in each country, and right would be this push ultimately back towards some standard. So the American standard is what we're talking about in particular with regard to that. So that is just a brief crash course on that and again, it's probably simplification, but what I want to talk about is why the left's toolbox was co-opted by the right, or how that worked. Okay. Now you can actually see this just in how people are framing the issue and talking about it. And so on the left, if you think about what it means to be woke on the left, what you're seeing is that you have advocates for social justice. They're saying, hey, we've become awakened to this idea of there being social injustice and systemic oppression. Okay, there's inequality. We need to right this ship. Well, on the right, there have been people who have claimed a similar awakening experience. In fact, I have a quote, which I'll show in a little bit, where people actually even use that language. And so on the woke right, this is basically a reaction to the woke left in many ways, but they use their arsenal, their toolbox, and their arms to fight the same way. And so it's usually done to frame the contest or frame the conflict in terms that the woke left did. So the woke left says white males are oppressing everybody else. Well, on the woke right now, you've had, this emergence of this idea, which is well received because it's a bit of a pendulum idea. But people say, now listen, everyone has unfairly criticized these white, men. They say that we are the problem. And I'm not a problem. I've been fighting against racism. I don't have racism in my body, And so the fact that they want to lump me together with all the other white men and say that we're a problem, Well, I think that that's wrong. And so there's a unity there among, guess what, white men, right? And so then there's this empathy. And so you have a couple key leaders that come along and say, hey, you know what? This is, there's nothing wrong with you being a white man. Take pride in your whiteness and in your masculinity, because and they might even say, look, this is the way God made you. Take pride in it. This is something that you can have. You are actually the victim because they are unfairly targeting you, and you are the oppressed one. At being a white male, you are oppressed, and so the system has been designed by the leftists. And who could argue, if you're coming at it from the woke right, who could argue that the left is in control of all the institutions right now, right? I mean, they're in control of the universities. Absolutely. They're in control of the government. Absolutely. You think of these things, and so obviously it's very appealing to people to start thinking in terms of oppressor-oppressed categories again, right? And so and by the way, that's not to say that there is nothing to be said about oppressor-oppressed categories. Sometimes that does happen. But when we're talking wholesale systems, that the left has designed a system in place, and maybe there are key actors in this. It's been thrown out so many times that the Jews are involved in designing this system to oppress certain people groups and things like that. And so there are often these scapegoated groups themselves that are said to be the oppressors. And so you quickly get people behind those kind of rallying cries, anything that allows them to be portrayed as a victim. Okay. So that's what's happening. And there are a lot of similarities between these views. Now, I actually want to show some similarities here. So if you're watching this, I'm going to put up a chart here, and it's going to kind of give a similarity between the woke right and the woke left. And so I'm doing this on Microsoft Word, but I think the chart looks fine here. And I'll describe it for those of you who are listening and being very productive with your time on the treadmill, running your 17 miles. So basically, if you think of a comparison between the woke left and the woke right, there are actually a lot of similarities. Okay, so on the left column, I have the different aspects here. And so the core belief of the woke left is that there's systemic oppression that exists due to race, class, or gender, okay, and, et cetera, with that, because you can have disabilities, you can have economic status, which I guess could be class, et cetera. On the woke right, there's systemic oppression, which targets specific groups like white men, okay? And, I think that has really appealed to people recently. In fact, I've had multiple discussions. In fact, actually, the week before I recorded this, there was a huge social media, discussion, firestorm, et cetera, about why in the world does Andrew Tate, who has, I think, 10 million X followers, why does he have such a influence among young men? In fact, there have been multiple people who have reported that even among Christian schools, Christian private schools, you have young men listening to Andrew Tate, who, if you don't know who Andrew Tate is, you are a blessed individual. But it's my job to pay attention to some of these things. And so Andrew Tate is basically he's an evil man. He's an evil man who he beats women. He's basically a pimp, and he, degrades women and all this stuff. But the reason he's attracted to people is because of his hyper masculinity. He says, listen, everyone's telling you that being a man is bad, but being a man, let's work out together. Let's show our dominance. Like, women are lucky to have us. And listen, in a society which is telling people that, being a man is bad, you're a part of the problem. Well, guess what's going to sell, right? You gravitate to somebody who is fulfilling, in the sense that you want something. You want somebody to tell you that you're actually worthwhile. You want somebody to tell you that there's actually a reason why you're a man, and you can stand up for things or whatever. And so he's become very, very popular. And he's not a Christian at all. In fact, I think he converted to Islam. I think. Am I right on that? I think that's correct. Somebody correct me in a comment about that if that's wrong. But you have an individual here who's very, very popular because he identifies saying, listen, don't be ashamed of the fact that you're a man. Don't be ashamed of the fact that you're white, whatever. And so I think that on the woke right, you have this belief that there is this oppression against the, white man. And so we need to rally together. We need to view ourselves as victims. Now, comparing again, where does the source of the oppression come from? So the source of the oppression on the woke left is the hegemonic norms. That's white supremacy, patriarchy, ableism. So ableism is maybe less known. That's just the ability of being healthy. So disabled, it's the opposite of that. So this priority of people who are not disabled to disadvantage those people who aren't as lucky, if you want to use that term, to be healthy. Okay. Now on the woke right, it's a hegemonic norm again, but it's a cultural progressivism that is the system that is fighting against you. So the progressives have set up this cultural system that has an anti-white bias in it. And by the way, is it true that there have been now this is where it's interesting, because in thinking in these terms, both sides, woke left and woke right, could make cases that there are people, like for example, from the woke left, there are people who are racist, who they actually would privilege white people over black people just because of the color of their skin. That would be the definition of racism. And so they would do that. And so racism does exist. We acknowledge that. On the right side, the woke right, is it true that there are companies, especially companies, that have flat out made it their policy to hire non-white people? So in other words, the only reason you can't be hired is white. So it's basically, again, the exact same thing. Is there are occurrences of racial segregation with regard to that. And so it appeals to people from both sides of the spectrum to say, oh, because I see some instances of this, then it's that way across the board. And so you start to think in these terms holistically, saying the system. Okay. So that's the source of the oppression, is the system, which is implemented by, the patriarchy, white males, versus, on the other hand, I've even seen some Christians say that feminism is the hegemonic norm now, and so that has influenced everywhere in society, etc. So, and what's key about this, I can't talk about this too much I can't go through this chart without talking too much. What's key about this is that even using data points to counteract some of these points. So, for example, if somebody says feminism has just infiltrated all of society and is the detriment to all of society. Well, what about, okay, let's talk about how many males are in leadership positions. Okay. Well, just because there's a majority male leadership doesn't mean that, feminism is not the hegemonic power structure that we're fighting against. Okay. Well, how do you disprove something if you don't have any objective standard, right? So that becomes a problem from the right. On the left, you have somebody saying, well, listen, white supremacy is real, and that's, the majority of people in these positions are white. Well, what about all the people that are Indian, that are CEOs, or that, you list different ethnic minorities? Well, that doesn't matter. All that matters is that we see the picture the way that we want, et cetera. So data points actually become irrelevant to the discussion. In fact, I'm not going to show it, but one of the videos I was watching in preparation for the episode was, I was doing some research on Andrew Tate, which is time I will not get back. But he actually had a video that Candace Owens had linked to, I believe. And it was about him explaining the fact that you should never look at data, because the data comes from the cultural hegemonic power source. So basically he was flat out saying, like, don't you dare use data to prove or disprove your point, because it comes from the system itself, and the data is completely controlled by the system. Now just think about that. That's why it's very difficult to reason with people on the woke left and woke right. Even though I think the majority of people are somewhere in the middle, but woke left, woke right, they refuse to actually have real conversations in many ways, because of the fact that they believe that the evidence that's even brought forward is a part of the system that they're trying to dismantle. Okay. So that's just part of it. Okay, now a view of privilege from woke left, woke right would be on the left, privileged groups, that's white and male, are blind to their role in oppression. Okay, so this is the critical consciousness idea that you need to awaken to your role in the oppression. And so the view of privilege is that these white males are the ones who are involved in those structures, those categories. They may not know it overall. And on the woke right, you have a marginalized group, usually white men, right? That's because those are the ones who are picked on by the woke left. And remember, the woke right is largely a response. And so white men are often blind to the fact that they are actually the low end of the totem pole. And so they need to wake up to the fact that they are marginalized. All right. So that's how it's often portrayed. And then the ultimate goal of the woke left is to get social justice through dismantling the oppressive system. And on the woke right, the ultimate goal is to reclaim cultural dominance and protect traditional values. Okay, so there's some similarities in the woke left, woke right, and then obviously the key audience for both marginalized groups that are seeking equality for the woke left. That's LGBT, they're a minority. Ethnic minorities, they are also by definition a minority. And on the woke right, it's the young, often white males who have been told, because you're a male, you're the problem. Because you're white, you're the problem, right? And so there's a ready group identity and group affinity there that people are just coming to. And they're saying, okay, so be it. If you're telling me that all white men are the problem, then I'm just going to gravitate to this group of white people. And if I'm the problem because I'm a male, then I'm going to believe that males are superior in every way, and so I think that there's a lot of similarities here between the woke left, woke right, and it's helpful to think through that. Now, there's other elements to this chart as well. As far as method, the similar method on the left would be raise critical consciousness to identify and dismantle the system of oppression. On the right, it would be to raise awareness of the culture and systemic bias against their group. So it's all about raising awareness, and so that's a key similarity between the two groups. And then the focus of the left is on inclusion, equity, and diversity. It's the DEI framework, right? And then on the right, it would be to restore a cultural and identity-based understanding, okay? So saying like, hey, let's return to the culture that we prioritize or we think is better. Don't have this idea that a pluralistic culture is best. No, we need to pursue one culture and one identity for our nation that is based on, X, Y, and Z. Okay. So very, very similar aspect there. Now, I also want to throw up a chart that I think is helpful too. I have just a couple thoughts on it, and we don't have time to go into as much detail on this, but this was a chart that I got from James Lindsay, and some of people on the woke right hate James Lindsay. And, it's interesting because, James, good old James, he gets hatred from the left and the right just because he's calling out both. Now he's an atheist. I did see that he was reading the Bible last year. And so that's cool, but he is an atheist as far as I know still. But he has a good finger to the pulse of the culture. Those of you who have tracked some of the things that I've done in the past know that I read his book Cynical Theories, which discussed which he wrote with Helen Pluckrose, and that discussed the really, he did a great job. And Al Mohler interviewed him on Thinking in Public, which actually alerted me to the book to begin with. But he did a great job just assessing the cultural impact of neo-Marxism and critical theories, the combination of postmodernism. And so, yeah, he really knows what he's talking about. And, it's interesting. I'm sure it's so frustrating for him to see what he had been arguing against for so long on the left and now seeing it on the right. I'm sure that's just, very discouraging for him. But I think as people who are in the church, we should also be aware of that for different reasons, right? Because we want to protect the church from these kinds of things. So he came up with this chart. And so you can see it on the screen. I'm just going to highlight some of the things. So on the woke left, It's kind of a Venn diagram is what he has. And on the woke left, he says that they admire international socialism. On the right, they admire national socialism. So a very nationalistic, nation-centered view versus, globalism. Okay, nationalism versus globalism, basically, on the right left. And on the left, you have them blaming men for a lot of their problems. On the right, they blame women for a lot of the problems. And that's so true. I mean, so many people on the right side of the spectrum have said that women voting is the main reason that America is in the place that we're at, which is, so strange to hear that as an argument. You also have, I mean, if you think about it, if the argument that men is the left blaming men is ridiculous. So I think it's fine to say that the right blaming women is also ridiculous, right? Because not all women are the same, right? If 50% of the world's population are women, it would be ridiculous to say that they all think the same thing or they all believe the same thing. And yeah, you just can't do things like that, obviously. So he goes on some other things comparing the far right, far left, but he does have in the middle things that they are unified on. So one of the things that he identifies that the woke right and woke left are unified on is obsessed with racial identity. And that's true. There is a very powerful movement that emphasizes racial identity and awareness, or ethnic identity, if you want to be more exact. I think ethnic is a better term than racial. And so, on the left, that's one of the answers to all the issues. On the right, that's one of the solutions to all the issues is, viewing things through that lens. And then it's also this idea that the left and right both want more government power. That's one of the things that he points out here. And that's actually been very, very strange for me to see, having, grown up in an era where it was always the conservative position to lessen government power. And now what people are arguing on the right is let's utilize government power to institute the changes we want. And of course, one of the downsides that I don't see addressed very often is when you increase governmental power to make those sweeping changes, what happens when somebody you don't like has that power, right? You can't just take it away. Once power is given, you can't take it away. And so, that's one of the huge issues. But now both left and right are talking about increases in power. And so that becomes a challenge. And one of the things that we ought to be cautious for. Okay. And then, both parties think that the U.S. Constitution is dead, that the Constitution should be jettisoned. And part of that is because the Constitution inherently tries to limit power. And so the right and the left, when they're arguing for increased power, they both talk about getting rid of part or whole of the Constitution. Okay. And then you also have both sides being perpetual victims, collectivists, and both sides hate Jews. Okay. We're actually going to do an episode on anti-Semitism, especially in the church, because I think that that's, our passion. We want to talk about that, but there's a lot of similarities and overlaps there. And I do think, on the chart here, as I'm looking at it, I think that Lindsay is onto something, seeing all these parallels. I gave you my chart. I think that this chart also represents things holistically well. Although I will say he has on the far left and far right a parallel that on the left, everyone should look the same. And on the right, he has everyone should think the same. That's his parallel. And I think I know what he's trying to say there, but I actually think that the right has their own version of everyone should look the same as well. So I think both of those things could actually be parallel. I think the left actually wants everyone to think the same too. So I think both of those things are correct. I think both of those things are paralleled. So the left wants everyone to look the same. In other words, equity, right? Equity, don't shame, fat people. Everyone needs to be okay. And, the idea that certain lifestyles are healthier than others is just a sham. All those things would be perpetuated. And on the right, obviously, everyone says, well, you should look the same. You should be healthy. You should be in shape. You should be muscular. You should lift, etc. So everyone should look that way. And so there is a push that way too. And that's attractive to people, saying, especially because the left says the opposite, right? So again, it's reactionary in many ways. But then also, I do think that there is groupthink that occurs on both sides, where on the left, if you don't think unified with the party, with the left, you are ostracized. And on the right, it's the same way. If you are an individual and you disagree on certain parts, that's not acceptable either. So there are certainly parallels with regard to that. All right, now I had some X posts, formerly known as Twitter, that I was going to show, but just looking at the time, it's going by fast. So I don't want to spend too much time looking at that. So basically, you can find this yourself, but I had some posts queued up to show that people on the woke right use the exact same language as people on left, just to show you that I'm not making things up. But you'll just kind of have to trust me or do your own searches, where people are saying that, oh, I've been awakened to this reality, or I woke up to find that we were oppressed and things like that. So the same kind of language is used on both sides. And so I think you can just trust me on that. Do your own research for that. But now I just want to emphasize, as we kind of steer the plane toward the runway, I want to ask, what are the problems for Christians specifically that happen when we embrace the quote unquote conservative woke narrative? And again, I just want to emphasize that my priority is Christians. This may come as a surprise to some people. I don't think many of the listeners and viewers would be surprised by this, but the majority of the conservative movement is probably not Christian. Okay. Like in heaven, they will not be in heaven. They may claim to be Christian, but the majority of the conservative movement will likely not be in heaven. Okay. I just think about, if we're basing salvation by God's grace, through faith alone as the standard, and those people who have, put their faith in Jesus Christ are marked by certain lifestyles of good works and obedience to Christ. I mean, that's a pretty narrow field. So just remember that the majority of people who are, just think about Trump and a lot of the people who are leading the conservative party. They're not Christians. There are some exceptions to that, sure, but there are many, many people who are not believers. So what would this mean to Christians if we wholesale embrace that? What are the dangers? Well, the first problem would obviously be similar to what we talked about earlier, and that's that there's an emphasis on that group identity versus individual identity or accountability. And so it's the same thing. And this is where, Christians just need to be adamant that our identity is in Christ. Our citizenship is in heaven, Philippians 3:20 says. And so we just need to be open about that. There needs to be no question in anybody's mind where our affiliation and allegiance lies. It's not with any party. It's not with any ruler. It's with Jesus Christ alone. Okay. And that's difficult for people. Now, I will say that a lot of times people get free passes in political parties because they're on our team, quote unquote. And that's how the left has always operated. Right. And so the right is starting to operate that way too. And I do not like seeing that. But the left, for example, Black Lives Matter protesters / rioters, they, damaged buildings, burned it down. They actually found the people responsible. They arrested them and then just let them go without pressing charges, because it was actually viewed as part of the natural outworking of being oppressed. Okay. And so that's some standard of justice, right? But then you have just random people who are protesting outside of an abortion clinic, and then they are, put in stocks and chains and, put in jail, right? So that's not really a fair standard, and that's the standard of the left. But it's also just as wrong if the right does that, right? And so people shouldn't get a free pass, even if they agree with our political views. We wouldn't give them a free pass just because they are conservative or they're a Republican or a Democrat or whatever. They don't get free passes because of their party allegiance. And even people who claim to be Christians, if they're not doing the right thing, we ought not to give them a pass, right? If they are in sin, we call it out and we name it, right? And actually, as a part of that, it's helpful to understand that, like I mentioned, racial identity is really emphasized by both the right and the left spectrums now. And the woke right does it just as much as the left. And I do want to throw up one tweet just because I think it's helpful to see. And it's one where here on the screen, it's a tweet from, let's see, I guess it was December 28th, and it was by Wokel Distance. I don't know who that is, but it was a comparison of Ibram X. Kendi and Andrew Torba. And so Andrew Torba is largely associated with the woke right. He is conservative on pretty much every issue, but like I said, he is leading the way to the right there. And one of the things that he posted on December 27th was you have two choices: be racist or be replaced. Now, just ignore his logical fallacy of the either or variety there for a second, okay? He doesn't get marks for being logical there, but he put two choices: be racist or be replaced. Now, his solution to the problem of all immigrants coming in, etc., is that you need to be racist against those people, okay? That's the context and what he's talking about. So ethnicity is playing a priority there. Well, guess what? And one of the worst books I've ever read is Ibram X. Kendi's book. I think it was called Anti-Racism, or How to Be an Anti-Racist. I think that's what it's titled. One of the worst books ever. I literally almost threw up while I was reading it. And one of the things that he says in his lectures and writings is that the only remedy for past discrimination is future discrimination. The only remedy for past discrimination is future discrimination. So what Wokel Distance pointed out in his tweet, comparing both of those statements, is that you have the same worldview going on here, where racism is viewed as the answer, right? Both from Kendi's perspective as well as Torba's perspective, racism is the solution, all right? And where does that come from? Well, that comes from this idea of group identities being maximalized, right? This is the essential nature of our identities. And for Christians, obviously that's not okay. Our main identity is found in Christ, and it is a citizenry found in heaven, as Philippians 3 says. So that is worth talking about a little more. So I'm going to identify that as a second problem, just to talk about it a little more detailed, is what happens with the woke right and the influence that has on the church is an overemphasis on racial or ethnic identity. And this happens in many, many ways. On the one hand, it happens in a huge rise of anti-Semitism. All right. So I've seen this in the church a lot, and it's so concerning to me. Even there was somebody in our church recently who was actually kicked out of the church because they were putting flyers, anti-Semitic flyers, in the restrooms at the church, that blaming the Jews for everything, blaming the Jews for the pornography industry, blaming the Jews for 9/11, blaming the Jews for, every, governmental overthrow, etc. The Jews are such an all-powerful people, apparently, because they have so much control over everything. It's kind of ridiculous. And I am going to do an episode on that, and I'm sure it's going to get nasty hate and all that, but I think it's helpful to think through as Christians. So we're going to do it, and I will suffer the consequences, but the show goes on. And so it's important to understand that the reason these things come up is because, or at least partly caused by, a emphasis on that group racial identity. Okay. And so you have the anti-Semitism. You also have a rise in this belief of ethnic superiority, and even, a view against ethnic intermarriage. For example, Stephen Wolfe, who made headlines for writing A Case for Christian Nationalism, he is often identified with this far right viewpoint. And one of the things that he has stated on the record, I'm not sure if it's still out there. I took a screenshot and I have the picture in my files. But he said that intermarriage isn't always wrong, but it is wrong for a group to advocate for it. So in other words, intermarriage is not always individually wrong, but corporately and as a group, groups have a duty not to intermarry with other ethnicities. And you think about that and you say, wow, that's kind of crazy. And again, that's where the parallel is with the left and the right, is that you have a lot of people on the right saying that, ethnicity should not mix. But remember, there's only one human race, and there have been a lot of people that have reviewed the problems of trying to defend this biblically, so I don't need to go into as much detail on it. But I would say, you go through any part of Scripture, Old or New Testament, and you see, inter-ethnic marriages throughout. Okay, and so that's a big part of, from a Christian worldview, it's a big part saying, listen, the color of one's skin does not matter with regard to whether you get married to them or not. Okay. It just doesn't. That's, from a Christian worldview, that is irrelevant. Okay. Irrelevant completely. And, it's interesting because I think around 2017, 2018, in the first Trump term, there was so many people in the news talking about how racism was just so prevalent on the right, and it really wasn't. I'm sure there was some there, but there have always been, white supremacists and racists and all that stuff. But over the last few years, there's actually been quite a rise. Maybe it's just been the social media presence or whatnot, but there's been a lot of actual racist activity. And what I mean by that is actually the inherent belief that some races are superior to others. Okay. That is literally what people will say now. They'll say another guy who's, associated with the Christian right is Corey Mailer, who had a podcast, and he argued literally that, white people are smarter than black people, et cetera. It's just that stuff's out there now. And yeah, it's just becoming more and more prevalent. A lot of times the Jewish people are thrown in there and compared or contrasted and said they're wicked or evil for a variety of reasons, inherently because they're just Jewish, right? And so ethnicity is really becoming a key issue again. And who would have ever thought that? It should not be that way. And in a Christian worldview, it can't be that way. Okay. And that is, this is just such basic Christianity. But in Colossians 3, you have this viewpoint exposed by Paul, which we've talked about before. But he says in verse 11 of Colossians 3, here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free, but Christ is all and in all. So in other words, in the church, there is no distinction between Jew and Gentile. There's no distinction between the Scythian, the barbarian, etc. And what a lot of people would try to say on the Christian right is that there's a distinction between the church and a nation. So the nation can function that way, but the church, sure, I have an affinity with believers in Africa, but they can't be a part of my nation or whatever. And just think about how insane that is. Like people are literally arguing that we need to, be Christian nationalists, or we need to apply, Christian principles to the governing of the nation. But when the Bible explicitly says there's no difference in our standing before Christ and our identity before him and who we are, that we should make a distinction. We should mark those identities. And so that's problematic. So hyperemphasis on ethnicity is not healthy at all. And so we need to be very vigilant against that as a church. A third problem, which is very, very significant here, and I don't want to underplay this at all, but it's an unfounded skepticism on all authoritative entities. Okay, so a skepticism on all authoritative entities. So, wokeness teaches people to distrust institutions, to distrust data because it's produced by those hegemonic power structures, right? And so one of the reasons why there's been a rise in this wokeness, people have awakened over the last few years, is because of the 2020 COVID pandemic, right? Everybody, okay, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people realized that the government was lying and trying to censor information that discredited their lies, okay? So that is problematic, right? That's problematic in certain degrees. And so people see that or understand that the government was lying to a certain degree. And they say, okay, well, that must mean the government is lying here, or all these entities that are in authority also have lied. So now there's a distrust everywhere. We need to distrust everyone at all times that are all part of these systems, these hierarchical systems of authority. And so you see a huge increase in people that believe in a flat earth, a huge increase of people that believe that we faked the moon landing, all these things. In fact, I read that 1 in 6 people from Britain believe that Apollo 11 landing was a hoax. So, a lot of people are just denying the moon landing and all that stuff. And it's because any data that's used, going back to what Andrew Tate said, and Candace Owens would say the same thing, is that, you have any data that comes in support of a position has to be distrusted because the data is coming from the people who are involved with putting those structures in place, the hegemonic norms, as it were. So skepticism is a hallmark of woke culture. All right. Now, I think it's okay to work to verify things, but the reality is that critical theory is one of the main outflows of critical theory is this skepticism. Because if you think about it, wokeness and skepticism, critical theory is working toward a distrust about everything. Because if you can't be, and this works with postmodernism as well, there's a interrelationship between critical theory and postmodernism, which Lindsay and Pluckrose talk about in detail. But the outworking of this is a distrust of everything. And if you can never be truly sure of something, then you can't take pride in it, or you can't know things for sure. So your identity is in flux, your confidence is in flux. And so there are problems with that, right? So an unfounded skepticism is a huge problem in the church, where you have people who don't trust all medical authorities, right? Listen, I have problems with many medical authorities, but to just wholesale say, the establishment is what's wrong, don't trust any hospitals, don't trust any doctors, that's so foolish, so foolish. And same thing with like scientific data, NASA, et cetera. You want to just say, oh yeah, these people are just, they exist to prop up a lie. That's the main reason they're existing. They're trying to, keep their structures, which are hegemonic in oppression against us. That's why they exist. No, that's dangerous, very, very dangerous. And we as believers need to speak against that and say that is just so dangerous for our own soul to live that way, where we're constantly assuming negative things about what people in leadership or authority are telling us. Okay. Now, at the same time, I've mentioned that I firmly believe that there are lies out there, that there are abuses of authority, but the answer is not going completely anti-expert. There is actually such a thing as expertise. I actually get a kick out of it when people, with 15 minutes on Google claim to know more than people who have researched a topic, gotten their PhD on it for 20 years, whatever, taught the issues. I know that's what we assume is equivalent sometimes, but it's not. There is actually such a thing as expertise. And so we need to recognize that. So discernment is key. That's the real takeaway. Discernment is key, but unfounded skepticism, not the key. Okay. So that's the third problem. All right. Number 4, got to wrap this up here. Problem number 4, ultimately emphasize. So this right wokeness emphasizes human solutions to a sin problem. Okay. And just remember, most people are not Christians in, the woke right. It is infiltrating the church, and that's what's sad. And that's why I'm doing this episode, because I know there are people in churches, mine included, that are influenced by people who are on the woke right, right? But we need to speak against these things, because the woke right doesn't provide the ultimate solution. For whatever reason, we think that if we destroy leftism, that's going to be utopia. A lot of times that's how it's pictured. But remember, most people aren't regenerate in the world, let alone the United States. Most people, even if, whatever it is, half to 60% of Americans claim to be Christian, most of those people aren't real Christians. That's just the reality of it, okay? That's just the reality of it. And we could measure that based on church attendance alone, all right? So even if leftism is destroyed, what's going to replace it? Well, biblical Christianity is not going to replace it. Okay, that's just a fact. So if leftism is destroyed, what is going to rise in its place? Well, that is how fascism arises and arose in Germany, for example. And so it's one of those things where we need to be very cautious about what we're doing. As Christians, we should try to destroy leftism. I hate leftism. But don't hold out salvation in the form of, the woke right or anything like that. The key point, as I've said multiple times, is that as Christians, our allegiance is to Christ alone, and we need to understand that we're kind of on our own team in many ways. That doesn't mean we can't have temporary alliances, and we can definitely enjoy certain reprieves from persecution and the like, but we need to be careful and wise not to form our identity in solutions that don't actually fix the problem. The thing that fixes the sin problem is the gospel of Jesus Christ, that he came to save sinners, regeneration. That's what we need to proclaim. And this is on a side note here within this problem. I think it's important to understand that on the woke right, a lot of the outcome is teaching people to hate people they disagree with, that they're the enemy. And we need to understand that our enemies need the gospel. Okay. So that's so crucial. And we need to be very, very cautious. That's what really bothers me with regard to what I see in a lot of Christian communities talking about the Jewish people and how they're always responsible for our problems, etc. Well, I feel like many of them would not be willing to share the gospel with people groups that they're disagreeing with, whether they be Islam, whether they be Jewish. There would just be a very dearth of compassion and the desire to spread the gospel. So something that we really, really need to be aware of when it comes to that. All right, last couple words. So why did I even talk about this? In fact, some people are just going to be upset. If anybody listens to this at all, I never know if anybody's going to listen to my stuff. If anybody listens to it at all, some people will say you shouldn't focus on this because you're punching to the right. You're attacking your allies politically. Well, number one, Christians should always be concerned with the truth and doing things rightly, okay? Just because Joel Osteen, just because he would align with me politically on almost everything, doesn't mean I'm going to give him a free pass, okay? I'm going to talk about him as a heretical false teacher, okay? Just because you have, Bill Hybels, go down the list, list all the charismatic prophets that have supported Trump and all that. I'm going to call them out when I get the opportunities, right? I'm not going to align myself with individuals who I don't agree with. And the woke right may be with me politically on a lot of things, and we may be working against the same common enemy, but the reality is that Christians do operate on a different sphere than others because, as 2 Corinthians 6 says, what fellowship does light have with darkness? There can't be fellowship, right? And so, yeah, you can have a small political alliance, sure, but it's a temporary one and it's not a lasting one. That's just the reality of it. So we do need to talk about these things, especially because my main concern is the church. I've seen it firsthand how people, especially young people, are being corrupted, right? And so we need to center our thoughts on what Scripture says rather than saying, oh, pragmatically, we can achieve this victory here, etc. Okay, we just need to be thinking about that. And also, the reason we talk about this is because it is infectious. This kind of thinking does appeal to people because they have seen, the left at work, and the left has done things that are just detrimental and cause them suffering and harm. And so they want a team to be able to fight back against this. And so that's attractive to people. And I do think that the woke left is still the much greater enemy because they are more powerful. They do have the numbers. Woke right is still very, very small. There's a ton of people in the middle. Woke right is very, very small, but they do have outsized influence in the church. And so that's one of the passions that I have, is just trying to alert people to thinking about these things. Just because the woke left is the greater danger and enemy right now doesn't mean woke right is not a real issue. And we need to warn Christians not to use the same frameworks that the woke left does use. We must use scripture. We can't use these critical theories and align ourselves in oppressor, oppressed class groups, etc. But that's often how these things are formulated. And people are divided into group identities, etc. So we really need to be cautious about that, warn people about those dangers, and hopefully this goes at least a small ways toward doing that. And so I hope it's helpful in alerting people to some of the dangers. Maybe you've seen some of this and you didn't really know how to put thoughts to it. So hopefully this kind of starts the conversation with regard to that. If it is or isn't helpful, you can always reach out. You can find the contact form on my website, peterhuman.com. You can always leave a comment on the YouTube video. I try to interact with as many people there as possible. It's just one of these things that we need to talk about in the church, and I hope it's helpful to do that. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you.